Good afternoon. Talking today about Picasso and the Ballets Russes. We have to look at the evolution, the rapid evolution of Picasso's style. And I think the best way is through his self-portraits. Starting with 1896, when he's still in Spain, in Barcelona, the young man, ambitious, and aware of his very, very strong talent. 1900, he does his first trip to Paris, discovers the capital and the cultural capital of Europe at that time, decides that he really wants to connect there because it's only there that it can happen. And the year after, not yet fully settled, he makes that very interesting self-portrait with the Je Picasso, meaning me, I, Picasso, showing his importance. But by the end of 1901, he changes his mood tremendously with the self-portrait of the Blue Period, which follows the tragic suicide of his friend Casagemas. By 1906, he's already starting a new style. He's starting primitivism. And the kind of style that's going to lead him to Cubism. That starts in 1907 after the Demoiselles d'Avignon. You can see a very different self-portrait, a lot of lines, and that anticipates Cubism. 1917, this is towards the end of the First World War. He spent the time during the First World War in France. He was living in Avignon in 1914. Most of his friends have been mobilized in the army, and some of them, like Apollinaire, is going to actually be wounded. As far as his love life is concerned, he had been refused by Gaby de Pere. He wanted to marry her. She wasn't interested. And so he will fall madly in love with Irène Lagoud, that you see here, a young painter, who was actually kept by a Russian Grand Duke in Moscow before coming to Paris. She then became the companion of another artist, Serge Ferrat. And when Picasso met her, he really fell in love with her. She wasn't sure she wanted to do anything. And Apollinaire and Picasso literally kidnapped her and kept her in a room for a week, from which she escaped and then came back voluntarily a few days later. She was herself, as I mentioned, an artist. After a few months of mad love, he wants to marry her. He is coming of age, and he really wants to settle now. He asks her to marry him, and she refuses. A few years later, after he's married, actually about 5 years after he got married in 1918, he will reconnect with Irène Lagoud and make this portrait of the lovers. Very different style. He is now in his neoclassical period, period that started during his stay in Italy, which we're going to talk about right now. So very different, much softer, but with heavy underline and patches of just straight color. Now, the group of people that surround Picasso is going to change. He is getting more and more known in Paris. And so his group of friends is getting broader, including now the very strange character of Jean Cocteau. Jean Cocteau, who was a poet, was an artist, a draftsman and painter, but was also wrote stage plays as well, that directed some movies that were at the time quite important and still can be seen on YouTube if you see, not all of them, but The Beauty and the Beast is one of them. He is an interesting fellow because he was gay, but very flamboyant gay. He would just go around, as you can see on these paintings. He would go on around with rouge on his cheeks and lipstick. He thought it was quite fashionable. He was a mingler. He would go into everything that was happening. He had to be at the forefront of any new things that was happening in Paris. Was very artistic, but sometimes had some very strange ideas. He really wanted to be the head of the avant-garde at all means. He was also indulging in opium, as many of them were doing at the time. And it took him quite a while before he got out of that addiction, only because one of his dear friends had died because of the addiction. He's a very artistic man. He has some drawings, what they call automatic drawings, that are, I think, absolutely beautiful. One is the faun with the twig in his mouth, and the other one is alternance. Very typical of Jean Cocteau style. We will see that he is going to meet Diaghilev, the impresario of the Ballets Russes, and he's going to be quite an intermediary between not only Picasso but other artists that they really want to see helping the Ballets Russes and participating to that great movement. But it's not only Jean Cocteau. There are other figures in Paris society that are quite interesting, and particularly these two women. First, Misia Sert, who was born Marie-Sophie Olga Zenaïd Godebska. She was of Polish origin, but became a patron of musicians and artists in Paris. Her pseudonym Misia is a diminutive of her first name, Maria. She got married the first time as a marriage of convenience to make sure that she would get out of the parents' house. That didn't last very long. She actually had fallen in love with a Spanish artist, Sert, Jose Maria Sert. And for a time, it was an affair until finally her husband had enough of it. And he divorced and she married him then. By that time, she already knew a lot of people in Paris and really helped and supported when people were in need. She would send them money, but made a lot of connections between them. She, as Cocteau, just loved to be portrayed and always was trying to be seen. She was a very pretty woman, and you can see the portrait of her playing piano. She was a very nice pianist. The portrait by Toulouse-Lautrec, and on the right, the portrait by Renoir that shows her very round forms, which Renoir always appreciated. She became a very close friend to Chanel, and is the one that actually introduced Chanel to the Parisian society by organizing a big dinner. Chanel, not being part of the group, had difficulty at breaking the ceiling at that time. And so it's Misia who organized a big dinner where she invited all kind of notables of the time and introduced Chanel to them. And that's from there that Chanel became the person that we now know. When she died in 1950, Chanel came running literally and was the one that changed her into her final outfit in her coffin. Another interesting figure and very different is Eugenia Errázuriz. Her family was of Basque origin, but she was a Chilean and patron of modernism and literally a style leader in Paris in the 20th century. She paved the way for modernist minimalism, the aesthetic of really simplicity. So all her houses and apartments were furnished in a very simple way with whitewashed walls, and herself would dress very simply, beautifully, but very simply. She also had a large circle of friends and protégés, including Picasso, Igor Stravinsky, Jean Cocteau, and other poets. Um, she, as I say, was very simple. Picasso absolutely adored her. Here you see her portraits by John Singer Sargent that she knew, and he made a few portraits of her. And the other one is Jacques-Émile Blanche, the portrait of Eugenia, which he Arguedas de Razouris. Picasso adored her, and literally she became known as Picasso's other mother. When he got married in 1918, he and his new wife, Olga, spent their honeymoon in her villa near Biarritz. Now, the last character that I'm showing here is was not going around Paris, though she had an apartment in Paris, but was Italian, originally living in Venice. Her parents were very rich. Her father was a magnate, had a tremendous amount of money, but both parents died in an accident and left her sister and her pretty young but very rich. And Maria Casati first married a rich Marchese, an old family in Venice, but then very quickly she fell into the charm of Gabriele D'Annunzio, who was a charismatic writer at the time, satyr, spiritualist, demagogue, and known as the Prince of Decadence. He was her great love, and he literally instilled in her that kind of madness where she wanted to always be very different, but to a point that is sometimes astounding. If you want to look for her on the web, you'll be surprised at the things you will read about her. She, as you can see here, she loved animals and was known to have a real menagerie at home with all kind of dogs, borzoi and greyhounds, but also cheetahs. She had a boa that had to be fed every day with live animals. We see her on the right with a costume designed for her by Léon Bakst, who is one that designed many costumes for the Ballets Russes. And all the jewelry that you see there, the pearls, were all regular jewelry, not fake, just real ones, with feathers of rare birds. She was, for example, she was living on the Grand Canal in Venice, and had a palace, which unfortunately at that time was kind of crumbling. And after she left, it was bought by Peggy Guggenheim and became the Guggenheim Museum. She was known, for example, to go out at night all naked with two borzoi and just covered with pearl and the skin of a panther, just to give you the kind of figure she was. She, unfortunately, very rapidly went through her fortune and ended up having about $25 million debt, had to leave everything behind, and went to finish her life in London in a one-bedroom apartment financed by her daughter. But she still was known to dress in a very special way. She would be found sometimes on the street looking in the garbage cans to find feathers to add to her outfit. So very special figure. And I think we have to try to understand that world if we want to understand Picasso and the others because they look kind of one of a kind, if we can say. But when we see all the money that was around them and these very individual, kind of outstanding individual, very different people, Picasso looks very tamed compared to them. Just for those that haven't seen this before, the origin of the Ballets Russes comes from two companies, from one company in particular, one of the two that existed in Russia at the time. We have the Bolshoi Ballet with the great Marius Petipa, the incredible choreographer, but a very classical program, repertoire, Don Quixote, Giselle, Le Corsaire, La Bayadère, Swan Lake, and so on. But there was also the Imperial Russian Ballet that had started about the same time, that became the Mariinsky Ballet, and later the Kirov Ballet in 1934, from which Diaghilev's come. He was for a while working with them, but then was fired and decided that he wanted the Russian art to be known in Western Europe, and particularly in Paris. And so first he made some exhibition of Russian painters in the salons. In the 1906, he brought a whole series of Russian paintings in the salon that got a large room just with Russian painting and astonished people with the beauty of their works. He then went on with operas that were very well received with Russian composers, and then finally decided the ballets would be less expensive than operas. And so he brought the ballet that became known as the Ballets Russes in 1909. But the difference of what was happening in Europe, first of all, the Russian ballet, the dancers were far more technically advanced than what they were in Western Europe. Also gave a much bigger role to the male dancer than what was happening in Paris or London. But what he really started is a phenomenon that we call in German Gesamtkunstwerk, which means a kind of a total art exhibition, if you want. So you had famous composers, famous painters, great choreographers, and all this together in one spectacle. So Diaghilev was able to network with lots of people and to find some very cutting-edge artists. He wasn't looking for traditional. He was looking for something new. And so he really gathered around him a whole series of young composers and young artists that participated to his things. He died in 1929. And unfortunately left a lot of debts behind him. So that for the time, and in 3 years, they tried to put it back together, and they became known, excuse me, as the Ballets Russes de Monte Carlo, with director Vassily de Basile and artistic director Honey Bloom. They didn't get along very well and finally split between the Ballets Russes de Monte Carlo singular form and original Ballets Russes on the other one. Both lasted about 6-7 years and then folded and just spread around the New World and in Europe and started new ballet schools. The Ballets Russes de Monte Carlo particularly went very international, but particularly in the US, and is really at the origin of the great companies, ballet companies in the US. Serge de Diaghilev, as we mentioned, had started with the Imperial Ballet, and became the impresario of his own company, the Ballets Russes. Was an incredible man, sometimes known as a tyrant, but also very generous, but full of idea. He was gay and had this one of the first very famous lover was Nijinsky, the great dancer, but went on with Massine and others. Under his time, so we have his timeline at the top, when he died in 1929. So he's going to use some musicians that either were from prior to him, and then use their music like Borodin, Mussorgsky, Tchaikovsky. But during his lifetime, he used Rimsky-Korsakov, Stravinsky, very important for Stravinsky. He's through the Ballets Russes that Stravinsky found fame. He was an unknown composer before, and by his collaboration with the Ballets Russes, he became very known, and with the Firebird and the Rite of Spring, and so on and so on. Prokofiev joined a little later. They also used music by Chopin. Gabriel Ferrer participated, and a reluctant Debussy, but with the Après-midi d'un Faune, which became one of his most known pieces. After 1919, we see that they go on with French and Spanish and Italian composers and English composers. So a whole series. We have Erik Satie, Manuel de Falla, Respighi, Stravinsky, Prokofiev, Constant Lambert, and Shostakovich. These are not even all of them. For as far as choreography was concerned, once Nijinsky was gone, we see the arrival of Leonid Massine, whose real name was Leonid Fyodorich Miasin, that was transliterated as Leonid Massine. He was a ballet dancer and a choreographer, and became the, how can I say, complacent lover of Diaghilev. He was himself heterosexual, but it was a good arrangement for him because he became very known and was able to network that way. But once he could, he left him, got married, and went on his own way. He was the first one that created the symphonic ballets, which were bringing a much larger orchestra, and was really based just on the music and not so much on the narrative. And here's Harlequin by Picasso that is portraying actually Leonid Massine. So we can see that in 1917, there is a change in the style of Picasso, and in most of his contemporaries that were doing Cubism before the war. But the war was so terrible, with such enormous loss of lives and such brutality, that the public didn't like Cubism anymore, which was harsh, which was just lines, and came to a much softer style. Part of the choreographer, important choreographers, was also Bronislava Nijinska. So the sister of the dancer Nijinsky became one of the choreographers of the Ballets Russes, bringing a very different touch, the touch of a woman, but also of a feminist. And we will see some of the ballet that she composed where she puts really pressure on the authorities around her to really bring that new flavor of a stronger woman, and giving importance to women's affairs too. Finally, Georges Balanchine, a name that is much more known to you, I'm sure, who was born Georgi Melitonovich Balanchivadze, was born in St. Petersburg, of Russian Georgian origin. He was invited to America in 1933 and became the founder of the School of American Ballet in 1934. He also took his standards from the Imperial Ballet School, with a very, very high technical demand, but a very different style, where he's using minimal costumes and decors in his ballets, just focusing on the dancers. So the first ballet that Picasso participated to is Parade, that had its premiere in 1917. The story of that ballet is quite interesting because Picasso, who had stayed in France and had met the composer Erik Satie in 1916, was kind of pulled in the project almost reluctantly. He didn't know at all the word of ballet. He didn't know what it entailed and wasn't quite interested. He was already famous by that time. But it's finally the convincing of Jean Cocteau, who met him, and Erik Satie, that he finally accepted to participate in that. And it's interesting when we talk about Jean Cocteau. Jean Cocteau was dying to meet Picasso, and he used all kind of tricks, sent him letters, tried to find friends that knew Picasso and that would introduce him to. But Picasso wasn't easy to approach. And so finally, he almost kind of imposed himself at his domicile. And he, in his biography, explains that that first meeting with Picasso was electrical. He couldn't believe how the charisma that figure of Picasso was really expressing, if you can say, the very, very intruding look of his eyes. He was looking at you in a very profound way, not too many words, but it became something that he recalled his entire life, and in a sense was almost in love with Picasso for the rest of his life, which of course wasn't reciprocated. Picasso started working in 1916 in Paris on the Parade, but it was always his last priority. And finally, Diaghilev, who was with the dancers and the whole organization in Rome, invited them to come to Rome to try to put it all together before it was premiered in Paris. And so Picasso didn't care for traveling very much. He never did. Took the train with Cocteau all the way to Rome and discovered for the first time the great Rome. And then he also went to Naples. The world in Rome was very different, though it was still the war in 1917. But the front, Rome was away from the front. The front of the war was in very northern at the border with Austria. And so Rome wasn't touched at all by that war. And so life was going on, whereas in Paris, they regularly had couvre-feu where they had to stay at home, and they didn't have were suffering sometimes of not having all the food that they wanted. Once in Rome, Diaghilev took them around Rome to not only see the different important sites, but also meet the important figures in Rome, such as Maria Casati, who had the palace in Rome too. And Picasso kind of shied away from that kind of society. He wasn't at ease there, and would find excuses like he didn't have the dinner jacket to go to that dinner, or had too much work and had to go on. But he found a lot of interesting inspiration in Rome. And that can be seen not only in this ballet Parade, but in different ones, including the fact that Diaghilev took them to a small theater in Rome that was an avant-garde theater, and they couldn't believe the influence of the futurist movement in Italy at the time, the kind of scenery they had and the costume. So this had an impact on what he's going to create for Parade. Diaghilev also took them to a puppet theater. Puppetry in Italy was very strong, still has some remnants, but they had wonderful puppets. And so this became also part of not only the inspiration for the costumes, but for Leonid Massim for some of the movement that were much more puppet-like than dancer. Here you can see the heavily restored curtain painted by Picasso and some helps, of course. The curtain itself had been folded in at least four by Diaghilev and used as a decoration in one of his apartments. And so it had unfortunately incurred a lot of damage and was restored lately to show here that quite interesting group of characters where you can find some Arlequins and Pierrot. Of course, we are in the country of the Commedia dell'arte, which is going to reappear later on in some of the ballets. Picasso had fallen in love with Naples, that he really loved. It was a harbor much closer to what he had known in Spain, such as Malaga or Barcelona, but also life. The nightlife in Naples was quite special. And he was faced there with groups of Commedia dell'arte on the street that were performing literally on the street. Here is a picture of Picasso and some of his collaborators to paint that very large curtain. Picture of Leonid Massin, who played the role of the Chinese prestidigitator of Parade. The storyline of Parade is very simple. It's just two managers of a kind of a circus who are trying to attract people to come and attend the spectacle. It's really goofy. We will see there's a little girl who goes around using typewriter and so on. The music by Satie included a lot of sounds that we'll find later on actually in the music of Gershwin, the sound of the street and some horns and noises that were up to then never included in musical composition. And here are the interesting costumes that were made. The one of the Chinese prestidigitator is inspired by the fact that Picasso had met the Chinese ambassador in Rome that was at that time dressed in full Mandarin attire, and that gave that inspiration. There were two managers. Actually, there were supposed to be three. You see the two of them on the right. The one with the pipe represents a French manager. The one on the left, sorry, is the French manager. The one on the right is an American manager. And you can see the skyscraper coming out of his shoulder, and also the loudspeaker that defines him. As you can see, these costumes are very cumbersome, were made of cardboard, and the poor dancers had very little chance to move into that kind of cumbersome costume. There was supposed to be a third manager, and he was supposed to be on a horse, and you see the horse on the left. The manager was supposed to be on his back and then falling regularly. That became too difficult, and so they kept the horse and just kicked out the manager. But here you have these costumes, which are actually reproductions of the original ones. The ballet was pretty short. It was half an hour. Really brought something completely new to the ballet, as you will see, but was a flop. People didn't care very much for it. But as far as the intellectual or the elite, it really brought something very different. So you've seen that kind of very avant-garde, very completely new thing. We are 1917. That's over 100 years ago, and this could have been performed nowadays and would still shock people with the that kind of novelty. You could see even at the time the little girl is doing some steps that are similar to Charlie Chaplin in some of his movies. So even Charlie Chaplin is getting into these ballets. While he is in Rome, Picasso meets a young dancer, Olga Koklova, who is of Ukrainian origin. You see her costume in The Afternoon of a Faun, circa 1916, on the left, and then a photograph of her sitting on a chair in his studio. Um, he fell in love, but she was a proper girl and a chaste girl and kind of pushed him back and said, you know, if you want anything with me, you have to marry me. And that was a very good idea because Picasso had never encountered that and felt quite attracted by that refusal, if you want. So after lots of effort and months of courting, and the fact that also she suffered some injuries while dancing, the marriage took place on July 12th, 1918. But prior to being married, Picasso had to first introduce the future bride to her parents. And when he came down to Barcelona with her, her mother, who was happy to have a potential heir finally in the family because he was the only boy, but wasn't happy that she wasn't Spanish. And so he's going to paint her, and you see that on the right, Olga in the mantilla, just the same way he had painted the same year the Salchichona on the left, which is more known. As you can see, Olga was a pretty girl, but very thin lips, rather stern. She was smiling rarely. But she at least accepted to get married with him. And so this is going to be a big thing because she's going to change him. She's going to introduce him to a world he wasn't too used to. Here is the portrait he made of her at the occasion of their engagement in 1917. After their marriage, they After their marriage, they very quickly she became pregnant and gave birth to a little boy, Paolo. And at that occasion, he painted these very maternal scenes in that new neoclassical style of his, uh, style that is neoclassical in the line, but with a very big difference is that all the women are very earthy, very strong, heavy, you would say. You can almost feel their weight on the ground. Here is after the birth of Paolo that you see on the right, a portrait of Olga. As you can see, Picasso can come back to a very traditional style. This is a purely realistic style of Olga. Despite the fact he has gone through Cubism, and we'll see that during his whole career, he decides in which style he's going to paint. And when he comes with a new style, it's just an addition to his vocabulary, if you want. As we will see in the coming paintings that he started doing in Barcelona, he does some paintings at the same time. He does some paintings in a Cubist style, where some others are going to be in a more traditional or neoclassical style. Here is a cityscape by Picasso, the Passeig de Colom, which is a known square in Barcelona with that column in the middle surmounted by a statue that is totally in a cubist, a part between cubist and a realistic style. And you can see his brushwork here with, you have the idea that the pigment is almost running down. Some places he's putting so much paste on the canvas. In the portrait of Blanquita Suarez, we back into the second phase of the synthetic cubism that seems to be almost a collage, but here is purely a painting, a known dancer in Barcelona. Something that is going to follow him, he's always been in love with bullfight, and this is that terrible image of the gored horse, and this image is going to follow him, and we'll see it many times in his Tauromachy and the Suite Volar, and later on in the famous painting Guercina of that dying horse. It's incredibly painful to look at, but very typical of his works. Pierrot, as we said, he, in 1918, he's just been to Italy, and that idea of the Commedia dell'arte is following him intensely. But again, this is made in a different style. And at the same time, he's going to produce that still life on the right, which is a very cubist work, that association of all kind of objects in different cases are very much of a part of the synthetic cubism. The Ballets Russes are going to produce a lot of ballets very different. This one that was produced in 1919, La Boutique Fantasque, or Magic Toy Shop, is on the music of Ottorino Respighi, who was based on piano piece by Giacomo Rossini. The choreography was by Leonid Massine. The libretto and the design and costumes by André Derain. André Derain being one of the Fauvist painters in Paris. A very entertaining ballet, far less difficult to watch than the Parade, where we see all kind of toys and little dolls that get animated because again, two of the dolls, two that are Cancan dolls, are going to be purchased by two different people, but the two dolls are in love with one another, so they revolt and disappear, and then they will come back, but be promised to stay together. So it's an easy narrative, and a lovely spectacle to see. Here is Alexandra Danilova, who was one of the great ballerina at the time, and Leonid Massine. So as you can see in the toy shop there, you see tarantellas, the Italian dancers, but you see also German dancers from the Black Forest in front of a miniature clock, and then Russian dancers. So this is almost a link with the Nutcracker, that very fantasy world. Picasso, by that time, has become the darling of the socialites in Paris, but will continue his collaboration with the Ballets Russes. And so they go to Spain, and they are inspired to do ballet El Sombrero de Tres Picos, the three-cornered hat, or the tricorne in French, on the music of Manuel de Falla, very beautiful music. The libretto derives from the novella by Pedro Antonio de Alarcón, and choreography by Leonid Massin, sets and costume by Picasso. And you can see here some of the decors and the curtain. The story is very typical. It's the miller and his wife, and there is a marquise that comes and wants to approach the wife of the miller. They decide to poke fun at him. And finally, he comes back hoping to get an affair with the wife, falls into a pond, hangs his wet clothes outside, goes and sleep in the bed of the miller, who comes back, thinks that he has an affair with his wife. But then the wife comforts him, and so they play a joke on him, take his clothes away. And so he has to go back to his own wife in the costume of the miller. So the choreography is adorable. The costumes are very pretty too. Here you can see, and the music is wonderful. I give you a chance to look at it. I'm going to send you the links to all these ballets. As I mentioned, while in Naples, Picasso had seen some scenes in the street of the Commedia dell'arte, and both Leonid Massine and him came with the idea of doing something about the Commedia dell'arte, and so they create Pulcinella in 1920. Again, music of Igor Stravinsky, as you can see. Sorry for the spelling error, but and it's a libretto based on 18th century play. So it's based on the four polichinellas, four similar polichinellas revolving around the stock character, again from the Commedia dell'arte, where one is pretending to be dead, and then the demon comes and wants his soul, and then he kind of laughs at the demon, and they are these beautiful figures, as you can see on that costume. So it's a kind of dark and white type of ballet, if you want. So they say goodbye. They say above the coffin. In 1921, The Tale of the Buffoon, it's the idea, it involves seven buffoons who all murder their wives after being told by an eighth buffoon that he has killed his own wife, and he brought her back to life with a magic whip and promises to do the same for them. Of course, when they realize that this is a fake promise, the other buffoons seek revenge, and the principal buffoon is forced to disguise himself as a woman and is chosen for marriage by a wealthy merchant, and so on and so on. The music this time is by Sergei Prokofiev. The libretto is by Diaghilev himself. Choreography, Slavinsky, who is less known. And then curtain, scenery, and costumes by Mikhail Larionov, who is one of the painters I presented before. He's one of these Russian futurist expressionists. He's the companion of Goncharova, who we will see soon also. Very beautiful costume, born into the traditional Russian folklore. Uh, and as you will see, the scenery is very colorful. In 1921, Picasso settles in Fontainebleau with Olga and Paolo. And it's there that he's going to paint his two paintings of the three musicians, which is a mixture of collage and oil painting, where he actually represents the three musicians. Himself being on the left, in the center is supposed to be Apollinaire with a guitar, and on the right, Max Jacob as a monk, Max Jacob that had joined a monastery by that time. We are still within the Cubist world with Picasso. The same year, the Ballets Russes will produce La Belle au Bois dormant, Sleeping Beauty, which is an old choreography by Marius Petipa, so going back to the Bolshoi ballets, music of Tchaikovsky, the libretto after Perrault, La Belle au Bois dormant, and the set and costume by Léon Bakst, who was one of the earlier artists and very different to what is going to be done after him. But his costumes are extraordinary, and his his drawings for costumes are quite beautiful. This is the curtain, and here are some of the costumes. This is the Bad Fairy Carabosse, who created the decor and about 300 costume design in 2 months for the Diaghilev production. This was premiered in London, by the way. And it's a beautiful, much more traditional ballet. This is the scene with the bluebird. In 1923, they came with a new ballet, Les Noces, a wedding, that was scored unusually for four vocal soloists, chorus, percussion, and four pianos. It was dedicated to Diaghilev, but what's interesting was choreographed Russian scenes with singing and music, and but it remained with the French title Les Noces, despite the fact it was Russian. It is viewed by many to be the first and perhaps the only overtly feminist work in the classical ballet canon. As you can see, the choreography is by Bronislava Nijinska, the sister of Nijinsky, and the designs by Natalia Goncharova, who was one of the most important futurist expressionist Russian painter of the time and the companion of Larionov. Definitely it's tinted of feminism when you see the whole ballet with it shows the condition of the of women in the marriage that were used, and so they resist. And in this case the ballet is quite interesting because there is very individual, almost no individual dances, but all groups, all women together or all men together that confront one another. Goncharova had designed these very simple costumes, originally in blue, but then were actually made in brown, that looked really like workers. Also for the pianos, Stravinsky had asked for a special type of piano that was supposed to change some tone. It was supposed to be a pianola, but then it was abandoned, and they constructed some cymbalons, later on known as luthiers, that he required. They were not quite ready when the premiere happened, but this is a picture of how it looks. So changing slightly the mechanism and adding some sounds to the piano that they didn't have. Here is some of the dance. Apparently Diaghilev cried when he heard it. As you can see, they are linked by her braids. Completely different in 1924. And I want to remind you, this is 100 years old. So when you see the ballet like Les Noces or Parade, it's quite incredible to know that they are 100 years old or over, because they are still so contemporary. Very different is Les Tentations de la Bergère ou l'amour vainqueur, Temptation of the Shepherdess, or Victor Love, made in 1924, music of Michel de Monteclair, who was actually a Baroque composer, so what was orchestrated by a contemporary director, oh, um, conductor, sorry, Henri Casatsu. The costumes, sets, and curtain by Juan Gris, the Cubist Spanish painter, and choreography again by Bronislava Nijinska. Here we have some of the design by Juan Gris. And here is another one. I have no video to show you. Unfortunately, it has not been replayed quite regularly. In 1923, so we go back 1 year, Les Biches, the Does, is a ballet in one act with the music of Francis Poulenc, libretto of Jean Cocteau, set, costume, and curtain by a female painter, French painter, Marie Laurencin, who was part of the group of Picasso and company in many, many ways, was quite involved, but has a style very different to the categories that we have shown. So it's very difficult for me to show her, but I'll do someday one program on her. Les biches in French has a dual meaning. It can be the does, but it's also the kind of frivolous, very elegant women. And it would be a term of endearment from a man to say ma biche. And so we see here the very typical designs of Marie Laurencin, who like these very pastel colors of pinks and blues and lilac colors. So the ballet was seen in Paris and London within a year of its premiere and has been frequently revived. In June 1922, Picasso went to Dinard in Brittany with his wife Olga and his young son, and remained there until the end of September. And it's there that he did that, at that time, diminutive painting of two women on the beach. This is still part of his neoclassical style, but as you can see, the women are statuesque and more, I would say. It is, though, going to be used later on a much larger scale as the curtain of Le Train Bleu. This was a new ballet with an amusing storyline. It is, again, in the 20s, you have that craze about sport and fitness. And so this is kind of poking fun a little bit at what happened. The title was taken from the night train called Le Train Bleu, the Blue Train, that was transporting wealthy passengers from Calais to the Mediterranean Sea, so from the north shore of the North Sea to the Mediterranean. The plot was just celebrating fashion and pokes fun at superficiality. As you can see here, the costumes are this time by Coco Chanel, the curtain scene, which is the one you see in front of you, by Pablo Picasso, choreography, Bronislava Nijinska, argument or libretto is Jean Cocteau, and the music by Darius Milhaud, another French composer. Here are some of the costumes created by Chanel. And a view of one of the scenes, so very typical, you have that feeling that they're along the shore and enjoying fitness and gymnastic and so on, with the, of course, typical costumes of the time. tennis is part of the sport. Romeo and Juliet, 2 years later, in 1926, is a very different thing. As you can see, it includes the music by a British composer, Constant Lambert, probably. The curtain is by Max Ernst. So we're getting into the surrealist period. Choreography again by Bronislava Nijinska. The sets by Max Ernst and Juan Miro, and the costumes by Juan Miro. Both these painters were really trying to go against the bourgeois society and declared an assassination of painting in favor of upsetting the visual elements of established painting, of course. When they collaborated for this ballet, for Diaghilev, it came out with very interesting, you can see, designs and costume. The plot is a surrealistic version of Romeo and Juliet, in which the lovers elope, departing the stage by plane in leather coats and ermine caps, complete with goggles. Here are the costumes. So for the women, work costume in yellow, and for Mademoiselle Mitimer, tutu, blue tutu. Here are some of the pictures of it. This brought an incredible protest from surrealist, the leadership of the surrealist movement, we can say, Louis Aragon and André Breton, where they could not understand the fact that these two painters, Miro and Ernst, had collaborated with something as subversive as dance. We thought it was a joke. Coming back with the Nightingale in 1926, we this time see the collaboration, and reluctant at first, by Henri Matisse here in the Nightingale that had been done before, is reviewed by Leonid Massine on music of Stravinsky, libretto of Anderson Tale, choreography Leonid Massine, and costumes by Henri Matisse that you see here sitting in front of the mechanical Nightingale behind him, and Leonid Massine standing next to him. On the right, a view of the ballet in front of the emperor. Costumes are wonderful. Matisse was really kind of estranged, as was Picasso, by the way, and the others, of the scene. The whole idea of making designs for costumes or even a curtain or a backdrop was very different of making just a painting, because you have the distance that changes everything. And for the costumes, they move. And so there are things that you have to emphasize. For the color, for example, Picasso was saying he had to work with a guy who was used to doing designs for stages, that showed him how, for example, to enhance the black. He had to add silver pigment in the black so that the black would come out properly. And so they had to sometimes come with artifacts, if you want to change certain colors so that from the distance they look good. The same thing was for the costumes or props. Picasso had faced the Farnese Hercules, which is that huge Hercules, while he was in Rome, and had found out that, in fact, many of the features of the Hercules were emphasized so that they would look correct seen from afar. And so had used the same tricks with some of his props and costumes. Here you see the profile of the costume. No, Matisse had pinned himself some of the feathers on the Nightingale's costume, but apparently the premiere, they weren't holding well enough. He hadn't counted on that she's going to go through amazing dancing. And so she was spreading her feathers all over the floor of the stage. In 1927, they present Mercure, which is a kind of a mythological spoof, music by Eric Satie again, costume, sets and curtain by Picasso, choreography Leonid Massine, that is just turning around Mercure, the idea of the Mercure who invented the lyre that you can see here on the floor of the curtain. And you have Harlequin and Pierrot with other instruments. Here is Mercure, just a sketch. Right. Now, for this ballet, Picasso had also created some props, and these props were using by dancers to take around the stage during the ballet. So the props became part of the dance, if you want. Here's a scene where Mercury slays Apollo in a more recent revival. The next one, Pas d'Acier, in English, Steel Steps, originally was called Ursignol, which was a contraction of the USSR. In French is URSS. It's a contraction of URSS and Rossignol, which is the nightingale, just in reference to Stravinsky. And so it's a ballet in two scenes containing 11 dances composed by Sergei Prokofiev. The libretto is by Yakulov and Prokofiev. Choreography, Leonid Massine, decors, Yakulov. Here we really see a celebration of the industrial revolution that has finally reached Russia. But it became a real problem for those that put this ballet together, because Yakulov, who was coming from Russia, was quite aware of the revolution and what was happening since the revolution. Whereas the others, like Prokofiev and Massine, had left Russia for quite many years and didn't realize exactly what was happening. And in their mind, didn't want something so industrial, but still bring in some Russian folklore. So it was softened, if you want, by Massine and Prokofiev. Very different ballet, as we see. That the variety is quite interesting. We will see the mechanization of ballet. As we see, the variety is incredible. One of the next ballets is Apollon Musagette, which means the leader of the muses. In 1928, it's a neoclassical ballet, choreography, new names, Adolphe Bon, And George Balanchine, music by Stravinsky, libretto by Stravinsky, designed by André Beauchamp, and costumes by Coco Chanel. Uh, in this case, you see pictures with Alexandrova Danilova and Serge Liffard, who was one of the dancers from the Russian ballet, but that settled in Paris and became a real figurehead in Paris. As a child, I remember hearing a lot of Liffard, who was very flamboyant and always part of the front page of the newspapers. Beauchamp was a naive painter and was mostly known as a painter of flowers, but also well informed in mythology and classical history. So this is the birth of Apollo. Um, the Fils Prodigue or Prodigal Son in 1929 is actually the last ballet that will be pushed by the Aguilera, who's going to die that year of diabetes. The libretto is by Boris Koshno, music Prokofiev, choreography Georges Balanchine, designed by Georges Rouault. He's a painter, a French painter who is known because he was one of the only one that was still doing some religious painting at the time. It's a beautiful ballet. It's based on the Bible, biblical story. It opens with the prodigal's rebellious departure from home, and then his seduction, and that's what we will see, by the beautiful but treacherous siren whose followers rob him. As you know, the conclusion, wretched and remorseful, he drags himself back to his forgiving father. This is actually a fantastic dancers too, but it's a beautiful ballet is in choreography. So in 1929, Diaghilev dies in Venice. He is buried on the island of San Michele. Um, and interestingly enough, many years later, in the 70s, Stravinsky dies himself in New York, and his body will be transported to San Michele and buried a few tombs away from Diaghilev. So as we mentioned the fact that Diaghilev leaves the ballet in pretty bad financial condition, and it's going to take a few years before they reorganize. And we see then the continuation with the Ballets Russes de Monte Carlo and the original Ballets Russes are both going to continue their thing. They call on, in 1937 and 38, they call on Matisse again for Black and Red, Rouge et Noir, choreography by Leonid Massine, a musical arrangement of Dmitri Shostakovich's First Symphony, and the set and costume will be again by Henri Matisse. Henri Matisse is at that occasion going to use his découpage. This is prior his big disease. He already had used some of these découpage with dance for Barnes. But we know that once he became really sick, this was the only thing he could still do, was the découpage. We see the picture of him later on with the big scissors that he was known to use. The stage curtain design, gouache on paper, as you can see, cut and pasted in the very center was the curtain for the ballet. The decor was very large arches. And here is Matisse putting his hand at it, pinning the cutouts on Markova. So here, I don't have the ballet, but this is the rehearsal for the ballet. So again, completely different. The Gaieté Parisienne, Parisian Gaiety in 1938, choreography by Massine, music of Offenbach, libretto Comte Etienne de Beaumont, who was also the producer, sorry, of the ballet. He put his money into it, did also some of the design, and then the costumes were by Barbara Kamrinska. Very entertaining ballet that, of course, is much easier to look, but definitely not the avant-garde that we've seen before. In 1939, they call on Salvador Dali this time to create the designs and the costumes. He was a very skilled draftsman and was known for his bizarre images in the surrealist world. So he came with this. Unfortunately, most of the decors have disappeared. The one on the left has been sold recently at Christie's. It was in really bad shape. Was supposed to contain some additional props in front of it, but that have been lost in time. Aleco, on the other hand, in 1942, calls on Marc Chagall. We are at the time where the ballets are going to be discontinued. We in the middle of the Second World War, and the ballets are at that time mostly in the US, and they find themselves cut from Europe because of the war and are going to be forced to sell the decors and the costume to survive. And then they will spread around the US and start some new ballet schools. And that's what we're benefiting from nowadays. So in June 1941, Marc Chagall and his wife Bella arrived in New York. And then they are called by Leonid Massin to do the decors. Now you know how it's worked in the States is that you have the unions, and somebody who is not licensed by the union cannot suddenly do something for stages. So they actually took the ballets to Mexico, and with Chagall painted his curtains and his costumes while he was in Mexico. Enjoyed the thing very much. He was totally unaware of the world of ballet, if you want, but enjoyed the experience a lot. Here you can see him in front of his curtain. It was premiered on September 8. So Chagall had only a little over a month to complete 4 backdrops and 64 costumes. He worked, and his wife worked along the seamstresses to prepare all the costumes. Just absolutely beautiful. They unfortunately were, as you can imagine, these are fragile and they've been used by athletes on the stage. And so when they were found, they were in bad shape and still are worked on by the curator of Costume Institute in LACMA in Los Angeles. And you can see here Martha Hellion that is working on the costume for Chagall. So this concludes the ballets. The ballets have had tremendous influence on the arts in general. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, this has been often neglected. Very few people knew about it. In Russia, there are now, many of the ballets are revived, but for 60 years, the name of Diaghilev couldn't be pronounced because he was supposed to be a traitor, though he was considered to be a traitor. Though Diaghilev was quite happy with the revolution, he was tired of the system with the Czar and the government with the Czar. And so he was for the revolution, except that once the weaknesses of the revolution appeared, he then took his distances. So for next time, we will see Dada and Surrealism in a very different world. Thank you very much.